There are windmills as far as the eye can see, and behind me, more windmills, but also tons of trucking depots, new industrial buildings. There's a power plant, there's a wastewater treatment plant, there's a huge landfill, but we get this really great atmosphere with some fog up in the air that's kind of giving a nice layer to all of the images that we're going to make today, which brings me to the point of this video. We're shooting with the Fuji GSW 690 Mark III with some Kodak Portra 400 NC. Shooting it on the TEX-PAN, see what we can get today. Fingers crossed they turn out all right. Let's explore and talk about this film. So we're shooting Portra 400 NC, which is a film stock I've never shot before, and it was gifted to me by a friend of mine named Keith, who came into a bunch of expired film. And as best as I can tell, this was expired since 2002, which means if we're following the decade rule, which we are, that we need to overexpose 2 stops to get the best results out of this film, which is what we're going to do today. We're shooting at ISO 100 instead of 400, which should compensate nicely. We've got a really overcast, kind of dreary, foggy day, a lot of lush green vegetation, and kind of bluish gray skies. So we're gonna try to capitalize on that with these panoramics. So I opened the door of this cat tobacco, and I wanted to see if I could get a shot of the logo of the cat on the back of the seat with some of the kind of like foliage coming in on the left, some of the cool reflections. It was so dark in there, and shooting at ISO 100, my shutter speed was like 1/15 of a second wide open at f5.6. So I decided to shoot f8 at 1/60th with the flash, which I always kind of carry on me. Hopefully it's not too bright. Hopefully it's not too dramatic. But it was the only way I was gonna get the shot. So let's move on down the line. When it comes to photographing this particular spot, there's a couple of interesting factors to take into consideration. You have this solar field right in front of us, then you have this windmill farm just in back of it, and then over here you have a couple more windmills that you can kind of see, but a lot of this stuff is just industrial trucking, depots and stuff like that. But when we're trying to photograph the windmill with the solar fields and all the vegetation, I think it's kind of important to keep in this chain link fence in some of the images, because it kind of shows that separation. You think deeply about compositions, and my mind would not naturally gravitate towards shooting it with the chain link fence, or shooting, the windmill with the chain link fence in the foreground, because it would just be kind of odd to see. But when it comes to telling a story, those are the elements that kind of make it a little bit more interesting. Now, the image may not be that great, but the idea is something, and it's something worth photographing in that moment, because you don't know really what it can play off of, if it might even work in a body of work. But I think it's an interesting composition nonetheless. There's a bird on one of the solar panels. Hold on. When I was a kid, my dad used to take us to work. My dad's been a truck driver for 50 years, and it was like the most amazing time. We'd go early, pick us up in the big old truck, this big, loud, noisy, like smoke coming out of the stack type of truck, sometimes with these big flat ends, the CB radio hanging, the air brake, letting loose, all those dials and knobs on the dash. It was just so cool to see as a kid. And when I come out and I see all these old trucks just kind of sitting here discarded, it kind of brings me back to like those times when I was just a little kid going to work with my dad, listening to Howard Stern, and being told not to mention it to my mother when I got home. But like just like those good old times, sitting in the truck, going from stop to stop, hearing him talking on his little radio. There's a huge subculture of like trucking in the 70s, 80s, and 90s that just doesn't exist anymore. Or at least if it does, it's very, very small. It's a very small community at this point. But back in the day, it was just so fun to get in the truck and go to work with your dad. And I look back on those times very fondly. Have a lot of nostalgia for that. So when I see these old trucks just sitting here like that, seeing the dials on the dash and seeing the leather, the blue leather like interiors and all this really gaudy stuff nowadays, it's kind of fun. It's kind of fun. So I've never shot Kodak Portra 400 NC before. The NC stands for natural colors, but with it being 23 years expired, the natural colors might shift pretty dramatically. Because it's an overcast day, they might turn a little bit blue, maybe overtones of green, or they might just be completely magenta or super warm, or this muted, flat, unsaturated color tones. Who knows what you're going to expect, but I am excited to develop them. But as we're kind of wandering about here, there is tons and tons of power lines overhead all throughout this area. Power lines scatter, litter this entire landscape, and if you hear the zapping, the buzzing, which you can probably hear right now, you're not going crazy. That's just kind of what we're dealing with today. Now, I do want to address some of the concerns about shooting expired film. There is a rule in the film community, it's called the decade rule, that people tend to follow and that I usually tend to follow. And that is to overexpose one stop for every decade your roll of film is expired for, or sheet of film for that matter. I found this rule to be pretty handy because it does give you pretty accurate exposures, and especially dealing with color negative film, there's a little bit more latitude with color negative, so even if it's going to be exposed properly, a stop or two more is not going to give you terrible results. But the one thing that you can almost certainly count on is color shifting. Now, I'm not going to color correct for these images. I want them to be as natural as they are once I develop them and scan them. I will do some minor corrections like spot removing dust and adding sharpness and maybe messing with contrast, but not overly, not overdoing it too much, because I do want it to feel the way that it's supposed to feel. But color cast, you're going to see color fringing. You might see completely different tones. You might see blues turn into purples and greens turn into yellows and all that kind of weird stuff. But color shifting is a very normal thing to expect with expired film. The longer it's expired, the more color shifting you're going to see. Another big one is seeing tons of grain. You're going to see a lot more grain start to appear in your images, and that just has something to do with the aging of the film emulsion and the spreading of those crystals. I'm theorizing here, but I'm assuming that those crystals will start to expand a little bit with the time that it just sits on that celluloid. That's a theory. I don't know if it's accurate, but it sounds good, doesn't it? I don't try to make things up as I go, but in this scenario, I really don't know the science behind emulsions. But tell me if I'm wrong, or if I'm right. You know, I gotta be honest, I've photographed this tree a dozen times and it always looks so cool. But when I drove by, I saw this big tractor trailer truck parked right on the side of it. And I thought it's just like the perfect encapsulation of the man and nature dynamic that I'm always looking for. And I thought it might look kind of cool in a panoramic. I think that's gonna wrap it up. It's my last frame. So I'll see you guys soon. Bye. I'm in the process of taking my film out. There we go. So I brought my dark bag. You might notice a bunch of stickers. Those are from my sheet film. There it is. And see. This is just sort of how I do it. Taping it to an existing spool. Gotta be careful not to drop it here. Right there, baby. The people that pass are not friendly. They never wave. And the people that I've talked to in some of these areas, they're also not very friendly. They don't care. They're curious as to why I'm photographing it, and they all think it's ugly and awful. That's part of life, finding the beauty in the ugly. And this is pretty ugly, let's be honest. And I know you can't smell it, but if you could smell it, you'd be offended because it stinks out here. It's terrible.